Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ, not for a 5-minute Bible study, but something a little bit more informal. I wanted to take you on a trip with me to the city of Corinth, which I was able to visit this morning. And, my videos are usually polished and scripted and heavily edited to scrub out my weird comments and my mistakes that I make. Usually I reserve my weirdness for my wife, but this video is going to be pretty non-edited. In fact, I'm going to try to do it in one take, which could be a disaster, but I just wanted to share this with you. I had the privilege to go to Corinth this morning with a friend, Ibrahim, who is a minister here at the church in Athens, and he's also very knowledgeable of the history of Greece. He's been living here for 7 years, I think he said. He's originally from Iran, and he's about to get his citizenship here, but he took us and he really brought the place to life. And he actually has a YouTube channel, which I'll share down in the description. It's in Farsi, which is the language of Iran, so you might not be able to understand it if you're listening to my channel, but if you know anybody, perhaps, who speaks Farsi, maybe you can direct them his way. But he's a great friend, and he just offered to take us to this place. We had no plans to go, and so of course we accepted. He said, "Let's go to Corinth and get coffee," and we said, "Yes, please." Anyway, Corinth is significant in the Bible for a couple reasons. Number one, the Apostle Paul visited there and lived there for about a year and a half and planted a church there. He struggled in that town, was persecuted in that town, worked really hard to keep that church going. And the second reason it's significant is because some of the letters that he wrote to the Corinthian church we still have preserved for us today, namely 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. So it was really interesting to go and to kind of lay your eyes on it. And, you kind of imagine as you're growing up, you're reading the Bible stories, you kind of imagine these places in your mind. It's interesting, though, to be able to go and actually kind of like place them in reality and like step foot in that place and to know that like, okay, this is like a real place and a real location. I can actually like drive here. And this was a place where these real historical figures spent their time preaching Jesus. So if you ever do have an opportunity to go to any of these biblical sites, I definitely encourage you to do it. And as you'll see, hopefully, in this short little video that I've made, some of the discoveries that they found, the archaeological discoveries and the layout of the city, they can help to bring the story to life. And also they can give some context that is sometimes really helpful in understanding the points that the writers are making. So I want to point a few of those out today. And again, most of this knowledge that I have actually comes from Ibrahim, who was our tour guide, so it's not really mine. I'm borrowing it from him for this video. And so let's go ahead and jump in. Oh, no. First of all, what I want to do is I want to go to Acts, and I want to read about Paul's time in Corinth, and then as we go through the video and some of the sites are displayed on the screen, we can understand them a little bit better based on Paul's experience. Okay, so Paul is in Corinth in Acts 18. Let me read, I'm just going to read a selection of verses here that kind of give us the key moments of Paul's time there. So it says, after Paul left Athens, which is where I am now, he went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. This is important. He goes to the synagogue. That's where the Jews of the city would have been meeting. And we're going to see in the video a few items that were found at this synagogue, and they have some Jewish symbols on them, which is interesting. So they come from the synagogue where Paul went to preach originally. Paul almost always went to the Jews in a town first, probably because he related to them, being a Jew himself. And so he preaches and presents the gospel to them first, but we'll see what happens here. How do they respond in verse 6? And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." So Paul says, the Jews, they don't want anything to do with Paul. And Paul says, fine, I will go preach to the Gentiles now. So let's see how he's received. Let's see. Let's look at verse 8. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. So many of the Gentiles who heard Paul, they accepted his message and accepted Jesus and were baptized. Let's skip down now to verse 11. And he stayed a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And he drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. So what's happening here is that Paul, he goes to the Jews first at the synagogue. They don't want to hear anything. He goes to the Gentiles. Some of them believe and are baptized. But then what happens is when this guy named Gallio is the proconsul, or he's kind of the leader of the city, or leader of Achaia, which is that region, the Jews kind of unify together. They're sick of Paul. They drag him before Gallio, and they accuse him of, corrupting the town. And so we're gonna see the place where this meeting took place in the video, and so watch out for that in just a moment. But they bring Paul before Gallio, and they say, "This guy's corrupting our town." And Gallio's like, "Leave me alone." This is a question of religion. If this was a question about violence or civil law or some kind of crime that Paul had committed, then I would bother with your guys' complaint. But since you guys are just bickering about religion and the Jewish law, I don't want to hear it. And so Gallio, dismisses this assembly, and Paul is not punished for this or doesn't get into any kind of trouble. It says after this, in verse 18, after this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria. So after a year and a half and some days, Paul leaves Corinth. So that's kind of the setup for the place that we're going. And now I guess we will get into the video, and I'll just have some comments. I'll pause the video maybe along the way as we go and make some more comments. But hopefully this is somewhat informative and somewhat interesting. All right, let me pull this thing up. So as you approach the city, the ancient Corinth, there's this giant hill behind it. It's really more of like a mountain. And on top of the mountain, you'll see a structure. And it's kind of unclear from the bottom as to what it is. And what it actually is originally, when in Paul's day, the temple of Aphrodite was on top of that hill. Now, Aphrodite was the goddess of love, and there was a lot of immoral activity associated with her worship and with her temple. And you read about this immorality in the book of Corinthians, and this is something that they were really struggling with. And so the city of ancient Corinth sits down below this mountain, but if they wanted to participate in some of this immorality, they could go up on the mountain to the temple of Aphrodite and involve themselves in all kinds of debauchery up there. And so that helps us to understand, why is this such an issue? Why is all this immorality such an issue? And why does Paul have to address it to such an extent in the book of Corinthians. It's because, this temple is up on this hill, and this is like a hub of this kind of activity in the entire region. Ibrahim, who we were with, described it as kind of like the Las Vegas of the Greek world. So you go up on this great hill, this great location, and you commit all kinds of sins, and that's what was going on in those days. So that's what Paul is preaching against, and he is in the shadow of that kind of sin when he comes into Corinth, and he is preaching Jesus and preaching that Jesus can change these people from that kind of life that they used to live. We got to the entrance here. There was a giant dog guarding the entrance, which of course I went up and pet because he was very friendly. He probably wanted snacks, but I didn't have any. It was €4 to get in, so not terribly expensive. And it opens up with a museum. This is at least the back of our illustrious tour guide here. This is inside the museum. There are several busts, several statues, and as you'll see here, most of them don't have heads, which I will explain why in just a minute. So we're walking up here to something very significant in the museum, something that shows us the Jewish side of Corinth. I'll pause the video here, and you can see something that looks kind of Jewish in this picture. You might be able to identify it. It's the candlesticks, right? They've got, 7, at least the middle one, 7 lampstands on these candlesticks. And if you read the tiny plaque that's above it and the stone that's above it, which I can't read because I can't read ancient Greek, it makes mention that this is the synagogue, or this is the meeting place. And so these were excavated from the site at Corinth, and they show us at least a tiny piece of this synagogue that Paul went to when he entered Corinth and started preaching to the Jews. All right, moving on. So the statues here, this is Ibrahim's information. He asked us, why do you think the statues don't have heads? And my thought was, well, they probably stole them, right? Because people are always putting those busts, those ancient heads in like their houses or museums or something, and it's kind of hard to steal the whole body. I was like, I think they're probably stolen. And he said, well, maybe some of that is true, but it's also because many of them were created without heads. And the reason that they were created without heads was because, government officials change, just like they do in the modern day. Rulers of cities or regions, or like the mayor or the proconsul, they change. And so rather than having to recreate an entire statue, all they would do is just replace the head. And then they only had to make a new head for whoever the ruler was, which I thought was very industrious of them. Very economical. There are some bones that were excavated here. And now, this is very interesting. Now we're entering into the inner part of the museum. And do you have any guesses as to what this is? This is a mirror, probably originally made out of bronze. And that's why that green corrosion is there. I think it's bronze. For any of you chemists out there, back me up. Probably made originally out of bronze. They didn't have mirrors like we have mirrors that are glass that, reflect your face back to you nearly perfectly. They had like these bronze mirrors, and the reflection that was coming back at you was not as clear as from the glass of a modern mirror. So it was kind of, you could see yourself, but not like incredibly well. And so this is interesting because Paul kind of makes a reference to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, in the first epistle that he writes to the Corinthians that we have saved for us in the Bible. So 1 Corinthians 13, it's towards the end of this chapter. Remember, this is the love chapter. And Paul is writing about how God himself and all that God is doing and all of his works in the world are not immediately clear to us. We know some things about them, but not all of them. We don't see them all in perfect clarity. And one of the illustrations that he uses in verse 12, he says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but one day we'll see face to face." So when you see a mirror like this, an old kind of rudimentary mirror that doesn't give you a perfect reflection, these words kind of come to life. Paul says, we see through a mirror. Well, he's talking about the mirrors of the ancient days, right? That don't give you, it's kind of like, oh, you got to get the light right and the reflection right to get even, something that reflects your face halfway decently. He says, we're looking through a mirror like that. And so those words make a lot more sense why the mirror is dim when you think about the types of mirrors that they had here in the ancient days. And interestingly, one was excavated here, I believe, at Corinth, unless they just put it in from somewhere else. Oh, another interesting thing here that Ibrahim shared with us. These are, you might be able to look closely. Look at the large image on the right and then the image on the left. They're kind of mirror images of each other. These are actually molds for making like these mini statues or these mini figures. And Ibrahim shared something from the book of Romans that was interesting. He says in the old Greek, in the Koine Greek language, there's Paul uses kind of a similar word to the word that would be used to refer to these molds in Greek. It's Romans 6, verse 17. I'll read it from the English Standard, which is my typical version, and then I'll read it out of the New American Standard because it uses a different word. He says, "But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed." Now, there's another word in the New American Standard that's used instead of the standard of teaching. It says in the New American Standard, to that form of teaching. He says, you were once sinners, but now you've been conformed to a form, the form of Jesus, and the form of what God makes you into. And Ibrahim said that the word that's used here refers to something similar to these molds. So you see the picture. When we are transformed by Jesus, we're pressed into a mold that looks like him, right? And continually, as we are shaped more and more into him, we conform to this mold, and then we become, hopefully we come out of this mold. And what do we look like? Do we all look different? No, we should all be reflecting the face of Jesus. So Jesus transforms us from what we were, this old lump of clay or something else, presses us into this mold. We come out looking like him. All Christians come out looking the same, or in the sense at least that they reflect their Savior and they take on his character and his nature. The goal is to be like Christ, right? So I thought that was really interesting, is that this mold kind of represents what Christians are supposed to be pressed into to become what their designer wants them to be. Going through the museum, they had all kinds of cool statues and several heads of the Roman emperors. I have edited out the nude statues. I didn't know that those were appropriate. But you have some stone beads here and some pottery, and they really had some pretty incredible technology. You then exit the museum and you kind of walk into the city. And so it's not a massive place, but it is somewhat expansive, and I was surprised at how much of it is left. I thought it might be just a few stones here and there, like a lot of archaeological sites, but there's actually quite a bit still at least outlined of where these buildings used to be, kind of the foundations in place. Now, the most striking part of the complex is this site right here. It was the Temple of Apollo. Down on the level of the city, you have the Temple of Apollo, who's the god of wisdom, of wisdom? He's god of the sun, maybe of wisdom? I can't remember. My Greek mythology is a little rough. But this is down here in the city, so you would have had rituals and events going on surrounding the worship of Apollo. And then up on the hill, you have the big site, the temple of Aphrodite. So Paul is actually right in the middle of these two places, and that's where he's preaching to the Corinthians. So he has his job cut out for him as he's entering here. And these pillars are really interesting because they're all one piece, Ibrahim pointed out to us. Whereas if you go to the temple of Athena in Athens, is that the Parthenon? I can never keep that straight with the Pantheon. The Pantheon's in Rome. We're just going to say the Acropolis. Yes, the Acropolis in Athens. The pillars there are done in chunks, in pieces, but the pillars here, they're all one solid piece of stone. So that's the Temple of Apollo. Moving on. This is the view of the Temple of Aphrodite that's sitting up on the hill from the city below it. And so literally the city of Corinth sits in the shadow of the worship of Aphrodite. And you'll see some buildings actually still, some of the walls standing there, which is interesting. And the sea is maybe, 5 minutes by car away from the ancient Corinth. So they weren't very far from the sea. Now here we're approaching something that's really relevant to the story that we read in Acts 18 of Paul's time in Corinth. What you see here is an elevated platform, and they suggest that this is the location where Gallio, the proconsul, was standing. He was standing on this platform, and then you're going to see a pillar below it, and this pillar was where the prisoners or the accused were supposed to sit, or maybe in some cases they were chained to this pillar. And Gallio is looking down on them and passing judgment on them. So Paul would have been down here at the bottom on the ground level. Gallio's standing up on this elevated platform, and he's judging Paul's case as the Jews drag Paul over here and accuse him of corrupting their city with all of his preaching. So we're approaching that platform now, and here is the plaque or the historical sign that sits out in front of it. Let me read you the relevant part. Let's see. Paul was brought to the Bema or the Vema, which is this elevated platform, by the elders of Corinth's synagogue, who accused him of submissive teaching against the Mosaic law. The proconsul Gallio, however, judged that the teaching did not constitute an offense against Roman law. So Gallio's like, I don't care about this because this is a Jew issue, not a Roman issue. I like to read historical signs. My wife, not so much. So we compromise and I read like half of it and then we move to the next place. Right here on the side of this elevated platform is the Vema, or I think it's Vema, and it just marks this location. Okay, so this is the bottom of the elevated space, the elevated platform where Gallio was standing. This pillar that is right here, close to the middle, at the bottom, to the right of the man. This was the pillar where the prisoner was positioned and sometimes chained to this spot. And so they seem almost certain that Paul is standing right there. Gallio is standing up on the platform, and the Jews are standing probably down here with Paul and accusing him. And Gallio's looking down at Paul and he's saying, let the man go. I don't care. He's not breaking Roman law. He can preach whatever religion he wants. So it's interesting that, you see here that Paul is being judged. He has opposition against him in the officials of the city who are passing judgment on him. And then a step above that, you have the temple of Aphrodite that is opposing him, and it's a pagan force against him, trying to prevent him from accomplishing his mission. But at least for what we read about in chapter 18 of the book of Acts, at least Paul doesn't catch too much flack from the Roman government. So this now, looking over you can see the ruins here. They were suggesting that a lot of these ruins were like shops, and where the shops used to be located, because this road that's running here is the Roman road. And it would have been, a primary location of transporting things in and out of the city and transporting them probably down to the water. where the ships would have been picking things up and dropping things off. But the Roman road is still present there, and they let you go down there and walk on it, and people have been walking on it for 2,000 years, and Paul probably walked on it and visited some of these shops during his year and a half in the city of Corinth. There's also some things, here's a plaque kind of, I think, commemorating this road, or at least stating exactly what it is. And then you can walk through these ruins and these shops. It's interesting that chamomile and like chamomile tea, that plant and flower, grows all around the area in Corinth. And then this is a shot kind of close to the exit where you can see the road, you can see the ruins, and then the temple of Aphrodite up on top of the mountain. And I was joking that, if you were going to go up and commit your sins up at the temple of Aphrodite, like, you were going to have to work for it, because you have to walk all the way up there. And I'm not sure that the video really does it justice, but this is like a proper mountain. And I can't help but wonder how many revelers may have fallen off of this mountain as they were ending their night of revelry. A plaque there, you can take a photo of it, and it's like a QR code that gives you some information about Paul and his time there. And then just another angle of the temple of Apollo. And these, I believe, were baths, like bathhouses. Some flowers that I liked. And another commemorative sign. Let's see if this one says anything different. During Paul's stay in Corinth, he was brought for judgment before the proconsul Gallio on the accusation of conducting illegal teachings. Gallio, however, refused to judge what he considered to be a mere religious dispute among the Jews. According to the tradition, the site of Paul's trial was the Bema, a large elevated rostrum, standing prominently in the center of the Roman Forum of ancient Corinth, and from where the city's officials addressed the public. Probably because of the monument's connection to St. Paul, the Bema was transformed into a Christian church during the Byzantine period. Today, the monument constitutes the historical seat of the metropolis of Corinth and the location where a great vesper is conducted on the feast of St. Paul, 29th June. Didn't know that. All right, so that pretty much brings us to the end of the video. Like I said, an hour, 2 hours, I think at the most is enough to explore this place. It's relatively cheap to get into. Here you'll see me standing on the Bema looking down, and there's the pillar where Paul would have been, down in moving towards the bottom right corner. There's the temple of Apollo in the background, and there's a number of structures in between there. So yeah, Paul really was between, I guess you could say, a rock and a hard place, in the sense that he's between the temple of Apollo, the Bema, and the temple of Aphrodite. And this is where he chooses to work, which I think is, a pretty incredible thing. The Lord has to tell him before he enters this city, do not be afraid. Seems like Paul may have had some fear in entering Corinth, but the Lord says, go ahead, don't be afraid. I'm going to be with you while you're working here. So maybe this should serve as an inspiration to us that, going into the hard places is rewarding, and that the Lord is going to be with us in that process. And so we shouldn't shy away from those, because certainly Paul didn't. So this was a real pleasure. That pretty much brings us to the end of our video here. It was a real pleasure for me to be able to go here, and it really just kind of helps you put the story together. And I hope that this video maybe has been able to give you some vision into where Paul was, even though you weren't able to stand here yourself. I would love to make more videos like this, maybe a little bit more professional than this, but more videos like this in the future for some other historical sites that relate to the Bible. And maybe when I finish the 5-minute studies, Lord willing, by the end of the year, there'll be some more opportunities to get some of this traveling in and to see some of these places. We'll see. Lord willing, maybe, or maybe he has other plans for me. But I hope that this has been at least somewhat insightful and given you a little peek into some context for some verses that are commonly read in the New Testament. And thank you for supporting this channel. Supporting this channel has allowed me to take some of these trips and to go to some of these places. And so thank you for supporting and liking and supporting on Patreon and sending money through YouTube memberships and one-time donations and all of that. That is super appreciated. And I hope that the content that we make here is valuable to people. That's the goal. And not just valuable intellectually, but valuable in bringing us closer to God.